So the British selected East Africa as their protectorate. A protectorate, ideally, is supposed to have a local autonomy, but with respect to foreign affairs, is supposed to have a reference to the colonizer, meaning the colonizer speaks for all foreign affairs concerning that region, but locally they can form their own laws, they can have their own leadership. Nothing like that happened. Immediately, actually, in Kenya became a colony. So a colony means you don't have any foreign or local autonomy. You're totally governed by the colonizing power. And that's how things happened. There was a lot of deceit and treachery. So in the process of that, the Foreign Office in Britain sent their administrator, their colonial ruler. He was called Sir Charles Eliot. And he's an important player because of what happens next. So Sir Charles Eliot comes in early 1900s. So Sir Charles Eliot has been described as an intelligent man, and he came here with one goal. There was a railway line. He looked around, he saw the kind of subsistence agriculture that was being practiced, the inferior technology, and he knew that it was never going to pay for the railway. And it sounds like a familiar story, but yes, infrastructure was part of the reason why he called for certain types of people to come to Kenya. And Sir Charles Eliot, just to tell you a bit about his character, is Colonel Mainatsagen, the famous Colonel Mainatsagen, who killed Koitalel Arab Samoei in cold blood in a time of peace. So he called him, he deceived him that they were forming a truce, and then he shot him and killed him. So that Colonel Mainatsagen, who has been called a colossal fraud and a charlatan, is the one who said in his book, Kenya Diary, of this Sir Charles Eliot, that Sir Charles Eliot, in fact I should read the quote, envisioned a thriving colony of thousands of European families, the whole of the country from Aberdares to Mount Kenya, to the German border dividing up into farms, the whole of the Rift Valley cultivated or grazed, the whole country of Lumbwa, Nandi to Elgon, and almost to Baringo under white settlement. He intends to confine the natives to reserves and use them as cheap labor on farms. This is Colonel Mainatsagen's Kenya Diary. I suggested that the country belonged to Africans and that their interests must prevail over the interests of strangers. He would not have it. He, Eliot, tells me he's having a terrific row with the Foreign Office over the infringement of native rights. Eliot hopes to attract thousands of Europeans to East Africa and does not appear to accept the fact that natives have any rights. So Britannica calls this Sir Charles Eliot a white supremacist policy maker. And that was because of the kind of insane or astronomical land concessions he gave to white settlers. He had no intention of leaving Kenya. He envisioned it as something that was going to be, their occupation of Kenya and their exploitation of the resources here was going to happen in perpetuity. So he gave more than 2 million acres of land away, primarily around the areas that have Colonel Mainatsagen has outlined, including notably 100,000 acres that were given to Lord de la Mer. Had that name before. A vast of land to Lord, and that referenced in British policy in Kenya, Colonial. I like to give the references so that in case someone is interested, they can look them up. So this was the kind of mindset he came up with, and after that they systematized their presence in Kenya as was required for them to form an empire. So let's talk about these white settlers. Because in Kenya, more than in any other British colony, the largest number of people were hanged. It was the most violent, brutal colony clash between Britain and the natives of Kenya. And the reason for that is partly explained by the kind of people who came to Kenya. Because unlike Zimbabwe or South Africa or other colonies, there was a requirement that, or there was a preference for settlers who had capital, who were wealthy. So that included the aristocratic class, you know, the Lord de la Mers and others. And also after the Second World War, more came in who were wealthy, ex-servicemen, military men who were wealthy. And so the kind of people who came here were of a wealthy breed, if I can call them that, a wealthy pedigree. They had a very racist, paternalistic mindset and an approach to life. So they would beat their workers. They had no problem beating them and you know, treating them very harshly. Perhaps it's the mindset of aristocracy, whatever it is. But that kind of contributed to that brutality and kind of the hatred that was beginning to brew in the local population. and the displacement. So as I was saying in the beginning, Sir Charles Eliot intended to pay back the railway line, and the best way to do that was to use this advanced mechanized agriculture and commercialized agriculture, so using cash crops, coffee, tea, and all that. And then they made this legislative council with literally no African representatives. So please note that at that time when they arrived here, there were probably maybe 5 million Kenyans, and maybe 100,000 Asians or Indians who have been brought in to do the railway line, you know, immigrants. And then there were other minor groups like Arabs, but Africans are the majority, and with very little or no representation in the Legislative Council. So you can already see they're going to be able to make laws that are repressive to the natives, and specifically the Kikuyu, who suffered the most land displacement at that time. So that was the kind of people who came here, and they were prolific writers. So, you know, the Elspeth Huxleys, and they were writing all these books about their experience here, and you can just see how overtly racist they were. Let me read some of the quotes. And this is important because they are telling the story of Africans. We were not as prolific in writing. And so the things that they have written continue to be perpetuated and believed as true because of how prolific writers they were. So Elspeth wrote a book called A Thing to Love. Charles Wilson wrote Before Dawn in Kenya. etc. Ian Henderson's The Hunt for Kimathi is writing about how they were hunting down Dedan Kimathi in the forest, and so on and so forth. There was a handbook that they wrote of anti-Mau Mau operations in 1954. Essentially, the British set up a proper propaganda machine, even controlling the perception of the international community about the insurgency and everything that was going on. They had a tight grip on it. And one of the things they say in this book, just to quote this called the Handbook of Anti-Mau Mau Operations, they said, the African is simple and not very intelligent, but very willing if treated in the right way. Do not regard him as a slave or an equal. So you can just see the kind of mindset that motivated this, the kind of brutality that was going to be meted out. And you can imagine the kind of resentment and it created, because it completely disrupted. It was a new social order, and it was very disruptive to communities and damaging because of the displacement, the landlessness, the taxes, the restrictions of movement, and we'll talk about that in a subsequent episode. So the question is, and some of the things I've alluded to as to how they ended up having such dominance, even though they were the minority, to end up killing more than 20,000 Kikuyus, mostly Kikuyus, as David Anderson enumerated in Histories of the Hanged, whereas only 32 settlers were killed. So that means for every settler who was killed, more than 625 Kikuyu were sentenced to hang. How are they able to do this? So, of course, we can just see the technological superiority of gunpowder. You know, they had superior weapons, they had been to war, and all that. That's easy. But they also had this propaganda machine, which I have mentioned, about producing movies and books and controlling the international perception of what was happening in Kenya very tightly. So if they, for example, there were certain events that would color them bad, then those events were suppressed. But any act of the insurgency was publicized, and they ended up actually, nobody even knows where the name Mau Mau came from, because they're called the Kenya Land Freedom Army.